Greetings, denizens of the internet. I am the Liberty Ambassador, and I am going to do a live edition of Hot Take, giving my views on the Democrat debate round 2 from last night. So the first observation that I have is that it felt extraordinarily similar to the debate on Wednesday night, the first Democratic debate, in the sense that everyone seemed to be trying to out-progressive each other. And on top of that, just a lot of the answers were very much the same. Very vague, very few specifics on exactly how what they wanted to do or how they were going to get it accomplished. Lots of people not adhering to the time constraints. Honestly, it seemed like the only person who did adhere to the time constraints was Andrew Yang, and the consequence of him not actually following the rules was he barely got to talk any. Which really, I think, says something about kind of the format of these debates. And honestly, I think the moderators should have the ability to shut somebody's mic off when they go over the time limit. And if they already have that ability and they're not using it, they need to. Honestly, I'd be tempted to have a sniper up there waiting in the wings to start taking shots at people when they go over the time limit. I wouldn't really do that. That's a joke. But seriously, they need to do something to stop these guys from going over time. It's just ridiculous. That said, I'll go ahead and start with Yang, since frankly there's the least to analyze there. He didn't get to talk very much, which is really kind of sad, because he's really the one person that I could at least consider maybe voting for. He's actually willing to kind of talk to people on the right and the left and people across the political spectrum. He doesn't tend to demonize, from what I've heard him say, Republicans and conservatives like many of the other Democrat candidates do. So because of that, I really wanted to hear more details on what his policies are, which is really a shame that he barely got to speak any. Now, the one thing he did get asked about very briefly was his proposal for the universal basic income, basically the idea that we're just going to give everybody $1,000 a month. And he bombed. Like there's no really getting around that. He did not answer that question very well at all. He tried to kind of answer it in a way like, oh, well, it's gonna pay for itself, seemed to be kind of what his argument was, which I don't think is frankly a very good argument at all. I've never bought this sort of quasi-Keynesian idea that free money from the government makes the economy grow. I mean, like, you can argue in a sense that it creates economic activity, because it's sure, if you give people money, odds are they're going to do something with it. But in order to even have money to give them, you have to take that money from somebody else. So there's always that question of, whenever the government does some sort of economic policy, whether it's like tax credits, social programs, or those sorts of things, sure, the government can go out there and tout, well, hey, look, because of this tax credit or because of this gift, X number of jobs were created. But the question is, was more economic activity created from that policy than there would have been in the absence of it? And the answer is almost the vast majority of the time, the answer is no. So I think that was a really bad argument. Now, a good potential argument for a universal basic income, and I'm not sure if his plan calls for this part, is if you're talking about, well, we're going to replace all of our current social welfare programs and replace it with a universal basic income. I do think you can maybe make an argument there that, okay, this is a way that we can do it without necessarily spending more money, in fact, possibly spending less, because there will possibly be less overhead, because rather than trying to manage all these different programs, we're just managing one. And rather than having to try to means test people or any of that, we're just giving the money to every head of household. So I could definitely see that argument being that It would be easier to manage. There'd be less overhead. And because you'd be giving people control over that money directly rather than the government, that you might get better results out of it. Unfortunately, he did not make that argument, which to me basically renders that policy just absolutely foolish. I think it's ridiculous to try to do that on top of all the other social welfare programs we have, because we're $22 trillion in debt as it is, and nobody likes to talk about this. Republicans don't like to talk about it. Democrats don't like to talk about it. But somebody needs to talk about it because it's important, and if we don't do something about it, we're all going to be in real trouble at some point. So the idea that we're going to add that massive expense of, I think one of the moderators said it was going to be estimated at roughly like $3 trillion expense. I may not have that number quite right. But basically a huge additional expense for this policy is very dumb. So it is really sad to me that Andrew Yang didn't get to speak more on his other policies, but I think he gave a very poor answer to the universal basic income question. Kind of staying on the topic roughly of the view of the candidates on the government doing stuff for people, there was a line from Kamala Harris when there were a bunch of candidates were kind of arguing and trying to talk over each other when it was, I guess, her time to speak, and she kind of basically silenced all of them with this comment. It was like, the American people don't want to see a food fight. They want to know how we're going to put food on their table. And I take major issue with that comment. Because the last thing that I want is for the government to put food on my table. That is not the government's job. The government's job is to prevent other people from taking the food off my table. And what I mean by that, in other words, like the government is supposed to have laws that protect my rights to own property so that people aren't trying to rob me or murder me or things like that. That is what the government's job is. The government's job is not to provide for people. And the fact that Kamala Harris seems to believe that that is the government's job, and frankly, I think most of the Democratic field believes that's the government's job, that's very concerning to me. Because, and I don't like to overuse the term socialism, but the idea that the government is supposed to provide your resources for you, if it's not an outright socialist idea, it's very, very close. And frankly, a lot of these candidates seem to try to be wanting to out-socialist each other. And not even necessarily in the social democrat way either, because there was a question that was asked by the moderators, who would support abolishing private health insurance? Well, actually, let me get this quite exactly right. The question was, would you abolish your private insurance in favor of Medicare for all? And if I remember correctly, basically every hand on the stage went up. Now, you can maybe kind of take the out, as I think Kamala Harris tried to, that like, well, they were talking about your private insurance, not private insurance in general. But I don't think from the context and how people reacted to it, I don't think that's how it was taken. So I think it's pretty clear that most of these candidates, not all of them, but most of them, do in fact support abolishing private insurance. And that's absolutely ridiculous to me. And then they want to try to be like, oh, well, private insurance is doing X, Y, and Z thing wrong. Okay, see, here's the thing. I'm not the biggest fan of health insurance companies by any stretch of the imagination. However, it's one thing to say, okay, this is imperfect. It's another thing to say we should get rid of it entirely. Frankly, that is tyrannical. That is tyrannical to say that we should get rid of the private health insurance market. Now, if you want to say, like some of the other candidates have said, that we should have a public option, I don't think that's good policy, but that's not necessarily tyrannical, I don't think. That at least gives people option. Well, the so-called if you like your doctor, you can keep it sort of thing. And it really is amazing how in such a short period of time, and a lot of conservatives frankly predicted this is where they really wanted to go, we've gone from the Obamacare model of we want to keep private insurance intact. We just want to make sure that everybody has insurance, to now screw private insurance, government healthcare. And it's really concerning. There's not really much other way for me to say it than that. Because even if you think that government should guarantee coverage of some kind, I think it's a very different thing from government paying for everybody's insurance, or giving a government option for people who can't afford private insurance. Again, I don't necessarily think either of those are good ideas, but they're still significantly better and less tyrannical than we're going to abolish the private health insurance. And that is actually a Marxist plan. Like that's not hyperbolic. That is straight up textbook definition of Marxism. It is the government seizing control of an industry that was a private industry. So anyone who supports the abolition of private health insurance in favor of a sole government option, when it comes to healthcare, at least they are a socialist. Not even like, a democratic socialist or a social democrat. Like, no, they are a straight up socialist on that issue. So it's very concerning that most of the candidates appear to support that. Now, getting around to one of the biggest proponents of it, Bernie Sanders, I'll actually have to give Bernie a little bit of credit here, mainly because he was asked something to the effect of, okay, you're talking about Medicare for all. It's a ridiculously expensive program. How are you going to pay for it? Or are people going to have to raise their taxes to pay for it? Or, sorry, are you going to have to raise people's taxes to pay for it? And while he didn't answer it initially, when they kind of called on him like, all right, we're going to give you 10 more seconds to actually answer this question, he did admit that, yes, people will pay more in taxes, but he says that the benefits are going to outweigh the costs. And here's the thing, right? I know some political commentators, I actually heard Ben Shapiro say that this was a bad moment for him in the debate. I don't really think it was, in the sense that I think I'm never going to criticize a politician for being honest. Sure, I don't think that a lot of people are going to I don't think people actually like the idea of paying more in taxes for more government to get more government benefits. I don't think that's going to be popular. But I do think that it's a good move for him to be honest, because I think that's maybe the one thing that could separate him out of this pack is like, well, you have these other candidates that are pushing really, really left-wing ideas and speaking very vaguely about them and not willing to have a real conversation about the costs or the benefits of it. They just want to kind of put out vague, happy-sounding anecdotes and try to rally people around that while hiding what they're actually going to do. So I think to the extent that Bernie is actually going to be honest and actually say, okay, yes, I do think we should raise taxes, but here's why that's worth it. To me, that is a much better and preferable approach to all these other politicians basically saying like, oh, we're not going to raise your taxes, when in effect, that's exactly what they're going to have to do to pay for these sorts of programs. So I'm not going to criticize Bernie for that. And especially like in the primaries, I don't think that's going to cost Bernie in a Democrat primary. It might hurt him in a general election. And even then, I still question that, because I do think honesty resonates with people. So I don't think it was as hurtful as some people, Ben Shapiro is the person I heard say it. I don't think that's going to hurt him as much as some people, like Ben and other people maybe believe. Now, moving on to some of the other candidates. The person that I thought, I'm not going to necessarily say that he did the worst as far as the Democrat voter base, but the person who just made me roll my eyes through the whole debate was Eric Swalwell. To me, this guy's an absolute idiot. It sounded to me like his basic pitch to be president. He went on this note. He hit this note many times. Was it's time to pass the torch to a new generation. He's basically saying, I'm young, so vote for me. As if that is any kind of a legitimate argument for why you should be president. To me, I think Eric Swalwell is one of the very least qualified candidates in the entire field, not just out of the candidates that was on the stage last night, but out of all the Democrat candidates who were running. The only person I could argue that is maybe less qualified was the author they had up on stage, Marianne Williamson, which I thought that was funny, how literally, that was her only listed qualification. That was her subtitle, was author. I'm like, so all you have to do to be qualified to run for president is write a book? Well, why don't we have J.K. Rowling run for office? Yes, I know she's from the United Kingdom, but still, it's ridiculous. Though to me, it's actually a little bit insulting that they put that as her tagline, because I actually looked her up. She actually is the founder of 2 different nonprofit groups. Now, one of them is more of kind of like an activist advocacy group. Let me see. I think I took down the name of it. Peace Alliance. Yeah, they're basically a kind of an advocacy group. And the other one is Project Angel Food, which basically delivers food to, I think it's AIDS patients and I think certain disabled people who either can't afford it or can't easily go out and get it. Which actually sounds, I haven't looked too far into, but actually sounds like a really good program. So I think she actually, in that sense, may be a little bit more qualified for the job than I think we're being led to believe, because at least she has some kind of executive experience being the founder of 2 nonprofit groups. So I'm really surprised, knowing that now, that they just listed her as an author rather than maybe they just figured it was too long to try to fit the subtitle for the other things. But that seems to be selling her a little bit short in my book, as far as saying that her main thing that's important about her in the context of running for president is that she's an author when she started 2 nonprofit groups. The latter seems to be far more important and relevant to her presidential candidacy to me. That said, I absolutely don't think she should be president. I don't think I agreed really with anything she said last night. She had this one kind of bizarre comment that a lot of other commentators talked about, so I don't want to focus on it too much. But this comment about the president has used hate for political purposes. I'm going to use love for political purposes. No, I'm sorry. What you are preaching is not love. And frankly, I think there's a huge misunderstanding of what love is in our society, and that topic is too deep. I'll talk about that in detail another time. But suffice it to say that simply, positive vibes and all this hippy-dippy feel-good stuff, that's not love, or that's not the entirety of it. Love is seeking somebody else's highest good. And sometimes that means doing or telling them things that they don't like at the time. It sometimes means telling people things that are not pleasant, or putting them through things that are not pleasant at the time. But you do it because it's going to make them better off in the long run. And that's what it means to love someone, is to do what's best for them in overall, not just in the short term of them feeling good in the moment, but what is overall going to make them a better person. So that's not the type of love she's preaching, and that's not really the type of love that really any of these Democrat candidates are preaching. And actually, kind of speaking of preaching, let me talk about Pete Buttigieg for a minute. Yes, I know his name is pronounced Buttigieg. I'm sorry, Butt is in his name. That's what I'm calling him. So Buttigieg made this comment about religion, about how anyone who says that God would smile upon the government putting children in cages has no right to invoke religious language ever again. One, and lots of other commentators have made this observation, but nobody is arguing that. I don't think there's been a single person of any influence that has argued that God is smiling upon this family separation thing that's happening at the border. I don't think there's a single person who has argued that. And two, I'm sorry, Pete Buttigieg, but you don't have any moral authority on which to speak here. Because like, look, this is a man who supports no restrictions on abortion. Are you going to sit here and tell me, Pete Butt Guy, that God smiles on women killing their unborn children? I'm sorry, there is not a single part of the Bible that you can point to that justifies that. There just isn't. In fact, there's many parts of the Bible you can point to that directly contradict that. So, and that's not even to mention the fact that he is a practicing homosexual. And I want to make a distinction here. I'm not saying that you cannot be attracted to people of the same sex and not have a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's not what I'm saying. You absolutely, though you can have the sexual attraction toward people of the same sex and have a relationship with Jesus Christ. You absolutely can. I think the difference with Buttigieg is he seems unwilling to even acknowledge that it is a sin, and is openly. I'll tell you, if he believes it's a sin, he certainly doesn't seem to care what God's opinion of it is. And I think that's a major difference to me, because we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We all have things that tempt us, and some of us sin habitually in a number of ways. I don't think that homosexuality is unique in that way, or that it makes you any less of a child of God. But I think what does make me question your faith is when you refuse to acknowledge that something is a sin. And even though the Bible is very clear on something, you are outright not only practicing it, but advocating that it is not a sin. When you do that, I genuinely have to question at the very least, your understanding of Christianity or your understanding of the Bible. As far as whether you actually have a personal relationship with Jesus or not, that's not something I can judge. That's something that is the only you and God know. But I can say at the very least, he has a very, very poor understanding of what Christianity actually is. But so I take major issue with that comment. One, because nobody's really making that argument that he claims they're making, and just because I don't think he really has any authority on this topic, to be frank. Another thing that he talked about was calling AR-15s, and he wasn't the only one who made this comment, but calling AR-15s weapons of war. And I am so sick of hearing that argument. And Pete Buttigieg supposedly is a veteran, and I haven't looked into his background on this. So if he is, I don't want to marginalize that. Thank you for your service, Mr. Buttigieg. But at the same time, since he is a veteran, he should know that the weapons that we use in the military are not the same as AR-15s. That's just a factually inaccurate statement, and I'll explain exactly how. The AR-15 is a semi-automatic rifle. The civilian version cannot fire any faster than semi-automatic. The military versions of those weapons, the M4 and the M16, have, depending on the specific model, either a burst mode or a fully automatic mode. And what burst means is basically when you pull the trigger, 3 rounds come out in rapid succession, as opposed to semi-automatic, which is basically 1 round comes out every time you pull the trigger. And obviously, fully automatic is just as long as you hold down the trigger, bullets are coming out. So, no, the AR-15 is not a weapon of war. That's factually inaccurate. The weapons that we actually do use in war have different capabilities. It looks similar. Some of the designs look similar, and they all have a semi-automatic function, but handguns are semi-automatic. So the idea that AR-15s are weapons of war and somehow significantly more dangerous and therefore ought to be banned from the streets is ridiculous. And while I'm on the topic of guns, let me get to what Eric Swalwell had to say about that. He basically is going to straight out ban AR-15s prohibit them from being sold, prohibit them from being owned, what have you. And then he is arguing like, oh, well, keep your handguns, keep your shotguns, as it, because basically what he was actually asked about that was, how are you going to sell this to the American people, many of whom, you know, are not freaking gun grabbers and actually believe in the right to bear arms. And the fact that he answered that with, oh, well, you know, keep your handgun, keep your shotguns, but weapons of war have no place on our streets. I'm sorry, you don't get to tell me what weapons I can and can't have. That is the core purpose of the Second Amendment, is that the government should not be able to tell people how they can or cannot defend themselves. And further, it goes deeper than that. The purpose of the Second Amendment is so that if you get tyrants in control, excuse me, if you get tyrants in control, that the people have roughly equivalent weaponry to their government so that they can resist that government. So the idea that, I mean, I guess at least the left is being honest now, like, oh, we don't want to take your guns. Yes, you do. And if they actually take away the AR-15s, you can rest assured they're coming for the handguns and the shotguns next. And then once they do that, they'll probably start trying to ban knives like they are over in the UK. I'm going to take just a quick sip of water here from the wonderful Leftist Tears tumbler. But so yeah, that's my thoughts on Swalwell, and I'll also get to his comments about how his argument for why he should be president is, I'm young. And I brought that up a little bit earlier, but I want to really delve into it now. That is a terrible argument for why you should be president. And as a millennial as someone who is of the same generation as Swalwell, I can safely say, if I'm looking for a generation as a whole to attempt to solve the problems of our nation, especially considering that there is a disturbingly high number of people in my generation that think like Swalwell, no, frankly, and obviously there's probably a lot of exceptions. But I don't think we as a generation right now are equipped to deal with the problems that we're facing. We really are, especially not the members of our generation who think like Swalwell. People who think that the government is supposed to take care of everybody and solve everybody's problems. Or furthermore, to think that the government even can solve everybody's problems. So that, to me, that was just a ridiculous argument. And I thought, and frankly, I'm surprised he didn't get more blowback from the other candidates than he did. Because basically, that seemed to me a unique way of saying, like, well, I'm not actually qualified for this job in any real meaningful way. I don't have any actual accomplishments. I've never actually run anything in my life. But I'm young, so vote for me. Get out of here, man. Come to think of it, he may not actually even be a millennial. I'd have to check what the generation numbers is on that, because he's got to be 35 to run for president. So he may actually not count as part of the millennial generation. But nonetheless, his argument for just vote for me because I'm young is a stupid argument. Speaking of stupid arguments, it appears that pretty much all the Democratic candidates now, except for maybe a handful, support giving health care to illegal immigrants. That's the thing that got me, hearing all the stuff about illegal immigrants and one not being willing to deport them. And now we're going to actually giving them health care? And when you combine all that stuff with, like, oh, we need to rebuild our image with the world, we need to rebuild relationships with our allies, what country are you running for president of? Are you running for president of the UN? Are you running for president of the world? Or are you running for president of the United States? Because frankly, as a citizen of the United States, I don't give a crap what other countries think about us. Now, there's something to be said for, yes, we need to maintain a certain level of friendly relations with other nations to get certain things done. But, other countries don't like the way we're doing things. Who cares? It's not their country. It's our country. And especially when it comes to the thing about illegal immigrants, it is not our government's job. It's really not even the government's healthcare to provide healthcare for us. It's definitely not its job to provide it for people that are not citizens of this country, for people who came into this country illegally. You do not have a right to come to the United States. You do not have a right to be given health care in the United States, especially if you are not from the United States. So the idea that all these Democrat candidates want to give these people health care is just absolutely ridiculous. And also the fact that they're basically advocating for open borders at this point without being willing to say as much. Because almost all of them seem to be okay with decriminalizing illegal immigration, which means we're not going to arrest or punish anybody for that crime, which means it may as well not even be illegal. And Kamala Harris in particular said that she wouldn't deport anybody who crossed our border illegally. So basically that equivalates to open borders, because we're not going to arrest the people that come here illegally. We're not going to deport them. We're not really going to penalize them in any meaningful way. So you basically have open borders. And here's the thing, right? As someone who's kind of associates with a lot of libertarians and libertarian groups, I think we can have a logical debate about whether or not it's better to have open borders or a controlled border. I'm personally not a believer in open borders, but I think that's a fair discussion we can have. We can evaluate the merits or demerits of that. But don't sit here and I'm like, we don't support open borders, while basically in fact supporting all the policies that basically result in open borders. It's dishonest, which really shouldn't come as a surprise, because the whole left-wing movement is built on dishonesty. It's built on obfuscating their real goals. And you can tell this just looking at the differences from what President Obama said while he was running for president and as president, to what the Democrats are arguing for now. Because I remember Obama saying many times, like, hey, we believe that people should come here illegally. We just think they ought to be treated humanely. And even with Obamacare, like, hey, we don't want to get rid of private insurance. We just want to make it better. And frankly, now the Democrats have thrown all those things out the window. And people were saying at the time on the right, this is a facade. What they actually want is amnesty and open borders. And what they actually want is single-payer health care. And that's proving to be true. So something else worth talking about was Kamala's attack on Biden, specifically kind of implying that he was a racist. And then the whole part like, you're praising of segregationists, which is not what Biden did, to be fair. That hurt me. Like, I'm sorry. Like, I don't, Kamala Harris, and this isn't targeted at you directly, but I don't care about your feelings. I don't care about the feelings of anyone, frankly, who's running for president. But your feelings are not an argument. It hurt me. Why is that relevant for a policy discussion? The fact that something made you feel bad is not relevant for what policies we should pursue as a country. It's completely irrelevant. That doesn't mean that you don't have a right to feel that you're wrong necessarily, to feel offended or feel hurt by certain things. But that doesn't give you some sort of special privilege. That doesn't make your argument any more valid. And when it comes to the situation about Biden, from my understanding of Biden's comments, all Biden said is, hey, look, I disagreed with these people, talking about the segregationists and white supremacists. I disagree with these people on basically everything, but we were able to find common ground on X, Y, or Z issue and still get things done. And frankly, to the extent that there's being anything noble about politics, is the one noble thing about it in principle is the idea of you have people with very different beliefs. And somehow you've got to come together and make policy with these people that have different interests and different beliefs, and somehow come to some sort of consensus to make policy that will ideally be best for everybody. And really, it's like, it's even if you go back to the founding of our country, there was intense, deep disagreements over very important things, moral issues. There was strong disagreements over slavery. Now imagine what would have happened if some of the founders who disagreed with slavery, or at least said they disagreed with slavery, had been like, oh, well, we can't associate with these people who believe in slavery. We're not even going to talk to them. We're not even going to try to get anything done with them. We wouldn't have a country. And there's a good chance that slavery would have never been abolished in the United States, because at least at a national level, because there wouldn't have been that unified force to do it. So, and here's the thing, right? Racism, white supremacy, being pro-segregation, all those things are morally repugnant. Absolutely. But the fact of the matter is, we still got to live with people. We still have to, especially as long as they are if they have any degree of power, which I wouldn't want those sorts of people to be in power, but if they were in power, like in the case where, like when Biden was in the Senate and he had to work with those people, you're not doing anybody any good by just saying, I'm not going to talk to him. I'm not going to talk to him. I'm not going to work with him at all. I'm just going to go out and condemn him and lambaste them every single day. And here's the thing, right? It's not that their position doesn't deserve to be lambasted. It's not that isn't a moral failing on them to support those things, because it absolutely is. But if you actually want to see things get better, sometimes you have to work with people that you think are evil. That's just the facts of it. So I think that Biden, so I don't see in that sense anything wrong with what Biden said. And the fact that Harris tried to basically condemn him about it, to me, is ridiculous. And I think Biden had a relatively solid response about it. And I think he probably, at least in my opinion, I think did better than everybody else in the debate because of responses like that, where he's basically like, look, you're over here trying to kind of imply that I'm a racist. I've been fighting for civil rights my whole career. I think Biden, I don't think he didn't say this, but I think he probably actually could have argued, I've been fighting for civil rights since before you got into politics. So the idea that she is trying to criticize him when it comes to civil rights is frankly ridiculous. So what else is worth talking about here? One last thing, I will briefly, because I haven't really talked about him at all, I want to briefly mention the Colorado governor, John Hickenlooper. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He actually probably was one of the more reasonable sounding people on stage. I'm like, he's clearly a lefty, he's clearly progressive, but he at the very least is trying to argue like, hey, but like I've actually done these things in Colorado. I haven't been up here talking about it, I've actually done it. And there's realistic ways to do this. We don't need to try to basically grab the American people and try to drag them down the road of progressivism. We need to kind of go at a steady pace, which is, at the same time, I think is more reasonable, but is also a little bit more dangerous, because it's really the smarter way to get the leftist agenda accomplished. It's something that Saul Alinsky, I think, understood. Basically, the idea that you go for the most left-wing thing that you can accomplish at the time. You don't go all in when people are not ready for that, when the public sentiment is not necessarily in your favor. least not on a policy perspective. Now, when an activism perspective, that's a different thing. But if you're actually trying to get policy accomplished, and this is why, frankly, the left obscured their intentions during the Obama years when it came to healthcare and immigration policy, because they knew those were not popular positions. So, I mean, frankly, as a conservative, I actually kind of hope they disregard. I actually hope they disregard Hickenlooper's advice, because it makes things easier for us. Because I think that these left-wing candidates, they're saying a lot of things that are going to do them very well in a primary and are going to do them very poorly in a general election. I've heard Ben Shapiro and some other commentators say a lot that really all the left has to do to beat Donald Trump in 2020 is not be crazy. Of course, the problem is that they proceed to go out and be as crazy as humanly possible, as is shown in last night's debate and Wednesday night's debate. I mean, and I don't like to throw around the term radical, because it's taken basically as kind of a slur, as an indictment against someone, like, oh, we shouldn't do this because it's radical. I'm not necessarily a believer in that principle. I think, to me, whether something is radical or not, it's just really a measure of popularity. Something can be extremely popular and be an extremely terrible idea. Something can be extremely unpopular and be a very good idea. So I don't like to kind of label people as radical, just because, even if I don't mean it that way, it's going to come off as, oh, because it's radical, it's therefore a bad idea. I think there's many good reasons that we can explain why left-wing ideas are bad without going because, oh, well, most people don't agree with them. But all of that said, I do think if you actually look at what most Americans believe versus a lot of the ideas that were put out there on the debate stages in the past two nights, most of these people, these are radical positions by the technical definition of the term. And again, that doesn't necessarily make them a bad idea. Like, I have some positions which I'm pretty sure would be considered radical by the American public. For example, I think Social Security and a lot of these other entitlement programs ought to be abolished. And I can go into more detail on that in another time. But that's definitely, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that that's a mainstream position, because it's not. I think that our whole federal tax code should be scrapped and replaced with a national sales tax, basically a variation of the fair tax proposal. Again, I think it's a very good idea, but it's not in line of, like, if you did a poll, most Americans would probably not even know what the fair tax is. So it's a radical idea, but it's not, in my opinion, it's not a bad idea. So again, it's not that saying that these the views of these Democratic candidates necessarily means that they're bad ideas, but nonetheless, it's going to, I think, it's going to hurt their chances in a general election, because they've got to now argue people into agreeing with them on those positions, rather than just doing what would probably be the easier path to winning an election, which is going after Trump's character flaws, of which there are many. And because that, to me, that's an easy path to winning an election, is like saying Donald Trump is a bad person. We should not have a person of this character running our government. Because you really can't attack him that much on policy as far as a general perspective, because the only weak spot I can really see as far as results would be the national debt. So you could go after him on that. And you could maybe go after him on, like, the family separation. But even then, that's kind of a bit of a moral argument on the family separation thing too. So I think they're digging themselves a hole here for the general election, which again is good for me, because I think it's good for the right. But I think the Democrats are going to go back and kind of regret a lot of things that they've said in the debate. So it's going to be very interesting watching them try to explain or walk back or justify a lot of these things, regardless of who the nominee ends up being in the general election. But anyway, that's my thoughts on the Democratic debate from last night. That is my take on it. I'd like very much to hear everybody else's take on it. If you want to comment down on Facebook where I'm doing this video. I'm also probably going to actually edit this one and the one I did last night together into a hot take, a more formal hot take, and put it up on YouTube. So if you happen to see it there, I'd be happy to check out your comments on YouTube as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall talk to you soon.